September 1918. Camp Devens, Massachusetts. The man on the autopsy table has turned blue. Dr. William H. Welch nods to proceed. His colleagues reach for the bone saw and begin to open the rib cage. The man's lungs are heavy. Welch and his colleagues lean in as they're opened. The lungs are so full of fluid that it's traveled up the trachea. The man had drowned in his own body, just like the others. Welch needs air. He opens the door and stumbles around men lying on the floor. There are no longer enough beds in the hospital. 6,000 men crammed in a facility meant for 1,200, and they're turning blue. This is a horror story, one of the most frightening in history. In 1918, a new disease emerged. We still don't know exactly how or where it first began infecting humans, but within months, it would spread across the planet, from the trenches of the Western Front to the most remote villages on Earth. It infected a third of the world's population and killed between 50 and 100 million people. To put that in perspective, the low estimate would make it twice as deadly as World War I, while the high estimate would mean it killed more than both world wars combined. Between 3 and 6% of the global population died within 18 months. It was the first modern plague, turning our interconnected world against us by spreading through shipping lanes, rail lines, and the arteries of industrialized war. March 4th, 1918, Camp Funston, Kansas. Like every military base in America, Camp Funston is overcrowded. The second largest training center in the country, Funston's 56,000 men live in barracks and tents, each waiting to be rotated to duty in the US or France. Diseases always break out when recruits muster for war, so it's no surprise when a private, a cook no less, reports for sick call with influenza. By noon, 107 other soldiers have joined him. Within 3 weeks, it'll be over 1,100. Alarming, sure, but this is wartime. Camp outbreaks happen. Even as 20% of the patients develop pneumonia and 38 die, doctors see nothing abnormal. But they're missing a key piece of the puzzle. A month before, and 300 miles away, the lone doctor in Haskell County, Kansas, had watched flu kill dozens of his strongest, healthiest patients. Its rapid pace and high fatality rate alarmed him so much that he contacted the Public Health Service and published an alert in the National Health Journal. But no one listened. The paper's obituary page was unusually busy that February, but alongside the reports of death and illness were heartwarming articles. Soldiers from Haskell County were departing for boot camp or visiting home one last time before deployment, all headed to Camp Funston, and from there to France. 2 weeks after the first case at Funston, 10% of recruits were reporting sick at 2 camps in Georgia. By the end of the month, 24 of the 36 largest military bases in America had cases, along with 30 major cities. No one noticed. Yet. Army Medical Department, Washington, D.C. Dr. William H. Welch was tracking an epidemic. One of the country's most famous doctors, Welch had helped drag American medicine into the modern age. He helped found the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, spread the use of microscopes, and organized the Rockefeller Institute, the country's first dedicated medical laboratory. His work had helped transform America from a nation of country doctors to a titan of scientific medicine, able to compete with the Pasteur Institute in France and the Koch Institute in Berlin. And America needed that scientific power now more than ever. Even before the war, Welch delivered a message to the Army Surgeon General. When mobilization happens, you'll have an epidemic. You'll need to recruit the best doctors and microbiologists. You'll need researchers, train cars outfitted as mobile research laboratories, a stockpile of vaccines and antitoxins, anything to be ready. When the war started, the Surgeon General didn't bother recruiting Welch and his researchers. He just enfolded the Rockefeller Institute into the Army. And here it was, the epidemic that Welch had feared. He could see it moving on the map from camp to camp, and it had killed nearly 6,000 already. He'd sent researchers to chart its spread and battle the secondary cases of pneumonia that were the real killer in most epidemics. They'd all warned the Army that this would happen if they overcrowded the camps. But no one listened. When infected American troops boarded troop ships, they packed into the holds until each converted ocean liner held twice the normal load of passengers. They pulled away from the dock, waving farewell to families and loved ones on shore, and turned towards Europe. It was in the bloodstream now, not just of the men, but of the world. In early April, it erupted among the American troops at their disembarkation ground in Brest. By April 10th, the first cases began showing up in the French army, which generally trained and served alongside American units. It was hard to notice at first. High fever, headache, and weakness could come from many diseases that swirled around the trenches, such as insect-borne trench fever or typhus. But it soon became clear that this was different. The troops called it 3-day fever, knock-me-down fever, or La Grippe. It rarely killed, but men who got it were out of action for days and lead-footed for weeks. The overcrowded camps and trenches of the Western Front were ideal tinder for an epidemic. Men lived within inches of each other, their immune systems compromised from exhaustion and disease. And unlike a city where the virus might run out of victims, here, fresh bodies were rotated onto the line every few days. It spread to the British in early May, and by then, there was no hope of containment. It swept through them like a bad spirit. English hospitals saw over 36,000 admissions for flu in a single month. Only then, when it began undermining the troops' ability to fight, did military doctors raise the alarm. The outbreak had sprung up during a critical phase of the war. The Germans had launched a massive spring offensive, and Allied generals needed every man possible on the line. But as spring turned to summer, the frontline hospitals of the Allies swelled to overcapacity. Men on the front lines would get ready to rotate to the rear, only to find that the unit ordered to relieve them had instead gone into quarantine. Medical tents had run out of space, and some hospitals took to laying patients outside on canvas tarps. In late May, a group of French recruits came down with it. 69% of them had to be hospitalized, and 5% died. By the end of the summer, 10% of the British Army had fallen ill. Back in Washington, D.C., Welch and his epidemiologists finally took notice. The flu, previously ignored, became a matter of national security. They set about turning the Rockefeller Institute into an information gathering and communications center for the disease. Welch wanted anything he could get his hands on: reports, lung samples, information on treatment, so he dispatched doctors to centers of infection to swab throats and collect samples. But all of it remained a closely guarded secret. No one wanted the Central Powers to know that the Allies were being weakened by disease. Upon entering the war, both the US and Britain had clamped down on the press with unprecedented censorship measures. When American officers denied or minimized reports of the flu, newspapers at home accepted it without question. The British, for their part, tried to strangle any mention of the spreading plague. But with the virus now infecting the civilian population, news of an epidemic started to leak. In May, the virus arrived in Madrid, and since Spain was neutral, it wasn't subject to wartime censorship. There, the flu made front-page news, especially once it infected the king. It whipped through Spanish cities, passing from person to person so fast that local wits named it after a hit opera song, The Naples Soldier. It was as catchy as the song, the joke went, if more deadly. International newspapers picked up the story on the Madrid outbreak and, erroneously, assumed the disease had originated there. And from those articles, the killer gained another name: the Spanish flu. But it wasn't just the Allies covering up the flu's impact. On the other side of no man's land, the German commander, General Ludendorff, was also wrestling with the disease. He'd retrained the freed-up veterans as assault specialists, stormtroopers, and launched his massive spring offensive in hopes of securing victory before the Americans arrived in force. As the offensive began, Ludendorff's army had better trained troops, superior tactics, higher morale, and for a brief time, numerical superiority. And at the beginning, it all went so well. German troops had captured more territory than they had since 1914 and driven a wedge between the British and the French. But the Allies had held on to the strategic port roads and railroad junctions. All the ground that Ludendorff captured was worthless, shell-churned dirt. And they'd taken a lot of casualties, so the next phase of the operation was critical. But as he began to organize for a final push, his generals requested a delay. The German army, you see, had the flu. They'd caught it in June, probably from a British prisoner of war, and by July it was sweeping the ranks. German troops, their systems already weak from food rationing, appeared especially susceptible to infection. 500,000 soldiers were sick. In some units, a quarter of the men were too ill to fight. Now, it would be wrong to say the flu defeated Ludendorff's spring offensive because there were other factors. It was an overambitious operation with a nebulous goal. He kept changing the objectives, units outran their supply lines, and he lost too many men. But German accounts do suggest the flu bled the army's manpower and resolve at a critical moment. And just as it had tipped the balance, it was gone. In August, British hospitalizations fell to the point that they had declared the epidemic over. But it wasn't over. For as the balance of the war was shifting, so were the virus's genes. Even today, no one's sure what happened. Perhaps the original, deadly virus had temporarily mutated into a mild strain, only to have its lethality reemerge. Or it may have infected someone, even an animal, that had a different version of the flu and the two viruses combined. It's even possible that, as it passed through millions of soldiers, this avian virus was gradually adapting itself to human hosts. Most frightening of all, the war itself may have given it a nudge, because the soldiers the flu infected had been exposed to a chemical agent known to cause genetic mutation: mustard gas. The soldiers' throat and lung cells laced with chemical weapons may have helped increase the rate of genetic shift and raise the likelihood that a new strain would develop. However it happened, the virus that emerged from the trenches was both highly contagious and severely lethal. It could kill within 24 hours of presenting symptoms, drowning a patient in their own fluids. And while common flu strains primarily kill the very old and very young, the 1918 flu struck people down in the prime of life. The mild first wave was over, and the second lethal wave was about to begin. In fact, it was already making itself known on the troop ships delivering soldiers to nations across the globe. 1 month later. Brakes squeal, steam vents. Dr. Welch and his team are pulling into a train station in Washington, D.C., returning from a grueling cross-country inspection of military hospitals. They hope to make their report and get some rest. Instead, a soldier meets them on the platform with new orders. Proceed immediately to Devens. Spanish influenza has struck the camp. 8 hours later, Welch and his team arrive in Massachusetts. They find Camp Devens paralyzed. Patients fill each inch of hospital space, turning blue and coughing so hard they tear their abdominal muscles. They hemorrhage blood from their noses and scream in fevered delirium. In extreme cases, the disease has ripped tiny holes in their lungs. Oxygen leaks out, collecting beneath the victim's skin, so they crackle when nurses roll them over, like the pop-snap sound of rice cereal. What is happening? At Camp Grant, a doctor sits in the commandant's office telling his commander that the overcrowding situation is dangerous. He's ignoring regulations. Too many men in the barracks and on transfer trains. The commandant's answer will seal his fate. In 2 weeks, the doctor will be back in this office, telling him that 500 men are dead. The last troop train they'd sent had turned into a plague train. A quarter of the transfers had to be hospitalized, and the camp had run out of coffins. Upon hearing this, the commandant will order the doctor out of his office, draw his pistol, and take his own life. But that is 2 weeks from now. At this moment, he says the overcrowding is necessary. This is war, doctor. But as bad as things are in the military, they're worse on the civilian front. The head of the Public Health Service is in denial. He issues a useless notice on how to avoid influenza and collects some statistics, but does nothing more. The military worries that raising public awareness of the flu will damage morale, and he's not a man to stand up to the military. And he's not alone. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, people are starting to collapse on the street or fall from horseback. Hacking, shivering patients fill hospitals. Employee absenteeism hikes up, but civic leaders refuse to admit the growing crisis. As Park and Williams race to identify the pathogen, with half their staff ill and some dying, the head of the New York Board of Health, a homeopath with no scientific training, denies there's an epidemic. In Philadelphia, the mayor and his health officials are telling the press that the outbreak is nearly over. They continue doing so day after day as the death toll mounts and hospital wards fill. The press buries flu reports in the back pages to preserve wartime morale. After all, panicked citizens don't show up for work at the shipyard. After making his report, Welch boards a train to D.C. It had been a period of exhausting, dangerous work. He feels bone-tired and has a headache. The symptoms start to show on the train ride. He switches his ticket and gets a room at his favorite hotel in Atlantic City. He'll remain there, delirious in self-imposed quarantine for weeks. USS Leviathan. Splash. A body hits the water. Days earlier, armed military police had herded troops onto the Leviathan, sealing them in watertight compartments. It was quarantine, of a sort. If one trooper had the flu, it would only affect the bunkmates sealed in with him. It spread anyway. There is no more room in the sick bay, the mess hall, or any of the other makeshift hospitals. Patients lie on deck in the sun and wind, and bodies only have one place to go: At the rail, a chaplain mutters a prayer. Splash. Another man disappears into the Atlantic. Splash. In 6 weeks, the war will be over. Splash. Leviathan isn't the only plague ship. There are many like it. The New Zealand transports HMS Tahiti and Mantua deliver the silent visitor to Africa. Infected ships pass the flu to dock workers each time they stop to take on coal. From there, it rides the rail lines into the interior, then spreads to the countryside on bicycles, horseback, or by car. Each of the 3 waves of the virus, the mild first wave, the deadly second wave, and the less lethal third wave, radiate across the globe. It storms every continent, sparing only Antarctica. Tracking the disease from the Surgeon General's office in Washington, D.C., Welch's friend and replacement, Victor Vaughan, expresses alarm at the flu's progress. If this epidemic continues at its mathematical rate of acceleration, he writes, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of a few more weeks. He looks at his map. Traditionally, Indians cremate their dead on the riverbank and release their ashes into the Ganges. But there's nothing left to burn. Dead bodies clog the wide river, gathering in clumps. India is no stranger to outbreaks. Just 2 decades before, the country had battled Black Plague. But the behavior of the British colonials during that time had made Indians wary of Western medicine. They'd herded people into health camps, burned personal possessions, and sprayed carbolic acid into homes. In other places, they did nothing at all. So even as flu whipped through the country, British officials offered little help and Indians accepted even less. Between 14 and 20 million Indians died from the flu, the most from any single nation. And yet the flu killed on, affecting each country in its own way. Japan called it sumo disease, since the first outbreak exploded after a public wrestling match. There, the wearing of face masks became so ingrained that it remains a practice today. It possibly killed 4 million on the island of Java alone. It raged through Russia and Mexico, both of which were in the flames of civil war. By 1919, it had penetrated even the most isolated regions, hopping from island to island out of New Zealand. In Fiji, 5% of the population dead. In Tonga, 10%. In Vanuatu, it killed 90% of people in some villages, wiping out 20 unique languages. And then it reached Samoa. Pago Pago, American Samoa. Commander John Poyer, the naval governor of American Samoa, liked to follow radio reports on the wire. It gave him news from the war, from home. He could keep his finger on things. Suddenly, one item stuck out to him: Spanish flu in New Zealand. He'd been governor of American Samoa for about 4 years and knew Western diseases posed special danger to Pacific Islanders. And with New Zealand having taken neighboring Western Samoa from the Germans, there was probably ship traffic passing between Auckland and Western Samoa's port of Apia. Poyer radioed his sister territory. Why, yes, they said. There had been a ship from New Zealand. And yeah, there was some local disease flaring up. Why? Poyer sent an order to the docks. Close the port. No matter who comes, deny them the right to land. Dock them at the far end of the pier and move anyone ill to Navy quarantine vessels. Work with the villages to form shore patrols and catch those who try to sneak in. He radios a warning to his counterpart in Western Samoa and offers quarantine and hospital ships if needed. The governor of Western Samoa, offended by the aid offer, hangs up. 1 week later, a mail ship arrives from Western Samoa. A U.S. Navy vessel intercepts it. They can't land, the captain says, nor will Samoa or any American mail ship in its port except outside letters. They must return to Apia. Furious, the governor of Western Samoa cuts radio contact entirely, freezing diplomatic relations. By then, people in Western Samoa are beginning to die sitting up in their homes. Fields go fallow as entire families are unable to walk. There will be famine next year. A whole generation of village elders gets snuffed out. 22% of Western Samoa would die of Spanish flu, including a third of the male population. American Samoa continued its quarantine until 1920. The third wave of the pandemic kept killing until 1920. But it was clear that the worst was over. Humans had done little to stop the virus. Instead, it simply ran out of fuel. Those who caught it became immune, and it spread across the globe so fast, infecting so many people, that herd immunity began to protect those who escaped previous waves. But there were still flare-ups. On November 11th, 1918, the news broke: an armistice. The Great War was over. People flooded the streets, ignoring bans on public gatherings. And in each city, a new wave of infections followed the impromptu celebrations. The same would happen again and again on a smaller scale, as loved ones gathered to welcome returning soldiers home. There were still outbreaks, still deaths, but everyone could see it was trailing off. The horror was past. All that remained was to count the cost, a project that continues to this day. In the years after the pandemic, researchers initially estimated the disease had killed 20 million people. Modern estimates have increased that number to 50 million. Though because statistics aren't available in the worst-hit regions, like India and Russia, the final number may be twice as many. According to modern estimates, it killed 17 to 20 million in India, perhaps 4 million in Indonesia, possibly 1 million in Russia, 400,000 in France, and 390,000 in Japan. In the United Kingdom, it sickened a quarter of the population and killed up to 220,000. In the US, it took around 675,000, more than the Civil War, and killed 16,000 in Philadelphia alone. But for a disease that killed so many, it's hard to point out direct consequences. In fact, the flu seems to have worked in tandem with the war, each magnifying the effects of the other. But the greatest lesson of the flu pandemic is that flu can't be ignored. We don't shrug off new flu strains anymore. In fact, many health organizations monitor both human and animal strains, predicting the dominant variety each season and creating vaccine ahead of time. If a new strain does arrive, we'll be much more prepared than doctors were in 1918. We have electron microscopes, antivirals, vaccine labs, and tested containment plans. But a vaccine would still take months to produce, meaning we'd start by using the same measures they did a century ago. Voluntary quarantine, banning public gatherings, staggering work hours. A century later, the battle against the 1918 flu and its offspring continues. So seriously, get your flu shot!